Come with me into a world where iron blooms like flowers, where glass captures the essence of morning light filtering through petals, where the boundary between the living and the crafted dissolves into something altogether more enchanting. We're going to spend some time, real time, wandering through the philosophy and practice of Art Nouveau, that movement which swept across the world at the turn of the 20th century and transformed everything it touched into something organic, flowing, and alive with possibility. Picture Europe in the 1880s, and you'll find yourself in a landscape of extraordinary contradiction and tension. The Industrial Revolution had been churning away for nearly a century by this point, transforming agrarian societies into urban, mechanized ones, with a speed that left people breathless and disoriented. Cities swelled with workers who had left their ancestral villages to tend machines in vast factories. The air in industrial centres like Manchester and Birmingham and the Ruhr Valley hung thick with coal smoke. Railways stitched the continent together, collapsing distances that had once taken days into journeys of mere hours. This was progress, certainly, but progress that came at a considerable cost to the human spirit. The things people used in their daily lives increasingly came from factories, and less items were lovingly crafted one at a time by skilled artisans. Walking into a typical bourgeois home in, say, 1880, you would find yourself surrounded by heavily ornamental furniture and decorative objects that, paradoxically, managed to be both ostentatious and soulless. Everything referenced some historical style: Gothic Revival chairs, Renaissance Revival sideboards, Baroque Revival mirrors. As though the 19th century lacked the confidence to speak in its own voice and could only echo the grandeur of ages past. The dominant aesthetic philosophy of the Victorian era embraced what we might call a kind of anxious maximalism. All surface needed decoration. Every object required ornamentation. Horror vacui reigned supreme. But this decoration felt applied and not integral. A chair became a framework for carved lions' heads and acanthus leaves that had nothing to do with the actual function of sitting. Into this world of manufactured historicism and spiritual disconnection came a generation of artists and designers who looked around at what industrialization and academic traditionalism had wrought and said, essentially, there must be another way. They found their inspiration by looking backward to the medieval guilds and the unity of art and craft that characterized pre-industrial production, but also by looking outward to the natural world, to the endlessly inventive forms that nature produces through purely organic processes. The name Art Nouveau itself came from a gallery that opened in Paris in December 1895, run by a German art dealer named Siegfried Bing, who called his establishment La Maison de l'Art Nouveau, the House of New Art. The name captured something essential about the movement's aspirations. This would be genuinely new art. Art for a new century that was dawning. Art that would finally speak in the visual language of its own time, instead of endlessly recycling the forms of the past. But Bing's gallery represented only the Parisian manifestation of something that was bubbling up across Europe and beyond, almost simultaneously, as though the cultural zeitgeist itself was ready for transformation. In Brussels, architects like Victor Horta were already creating buildings that seemed to grow from the earth, rather than being imposed upon it. In Barcelona, a young Antoni Gaudí was beginning his lifelong love affair with organic forms and structural innovation. In Glasgow, Charles Rennie Mackintosh was developing his own austere, elegant version of the new aesthetic. In Vienna, Gustav Klimt and his fellow secessionists were breaking away from academic art to create something that shimmered with gold leaf and erotic energy and symbolic mystery. At the heart of Art Nouveau lies what might seem like a simple formal preference, but actually represents an entire philosophy of design and aesthetics. The supremacy of the curve over the straight line, of the organic over the geometric, of growth over construction. When you look at an Art Nouveau object or building or poster, your eye travels along flowing, sinuous lines that seem to move with their own internal energy. These curves have been called whiplash lines for the way they snap and undulate like a whip being cracked, or like a ribbon floating through water. But these curves represented far more than mere stylistic preference. They embodied a conviction that truth and beauty resided in natural forms, that the way a plant grows toward light or water flows over stone contained lessons about harmony and rightness that centuries of academic rules about proportion and symmetry had obscured. An Art Nouveau designer looking at a lily would see the elegant S-curve of its stem, the way the petals unfurled from the center following mathematical principles that predated human geometry. The organic logic that made every part of the plant relate to every other part in a coherent whole. This worship of the curve and the organic represented in some profound sense a rebellion against the mechanization and rationalization that characterized modern industrial society. The machine age loved straight lines and right angles because they were efficient to manufacture and easy to reproduce. A factory could stamp out thousands of identical rectangular components, but curves, particularly complex, flowing curves, resisted mechanization. They required the hand of a skilled craftsperson who understood how to coax metal into plant-like forms or how to cut glass so it captured light like a dewdrop. Yet here we encounter one of Art Nouveau's most fascinating contradictions. While the movement celebrated organic forms and craftsmanship, it also embraced modern materials and technologies with enthusiasm. Iron and glass, those quintessentially industrial materials, became the primary media for Art Nouveau's most spectacular achievements. The movement sought beauty through a kind of synthesis, using modern materials to create effects that evoked the natural and the handmade, employing industrial techniques in service of anti-industrial aesthetics. Think about what iron meant in the late 19th century. This was the material of railway bridges and factory halls, of utilitarian structures that made no claims to beauty. The great iron constructions of the era, the Crystal Palace in London, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the train sheds of major railway stations, were celebrated as engineering triumphs, but often dismissed as aesthetically crude by those who believed that true architecture required stone and traditional ornamentation. Art Nouveau designers looked at iron and saw something entirely different. They recognized that iron, when heated and worked by skilled craftspeople, possessed a kind of plasticity, a willingness to be shaped into almost any form imaginable. In their hands, iron became as expressive as any traditional artistic medium. The Parisian architect Hector Guimard demonstrated this transformation brilliantly in his entrances for the Paris Metro, constructed between 1900 and 1913. These pavilions, with their sinuous, green-painted iron structures, turned the mundane act of descending into a subway station into a counter with organic beauty. The iron elements branch and curve like plant stems, supporting panels of glass and creating protective canopies over the stairs. The typography on the signs curves and flows, integrating seamlessly with the metal structures. The overall effect suggests something grown rather than built, as though the entrance had sprouted from the Parisian sidewalk overnight, like some marvelous urban mushroom. What made Guimard's metro entrances so revolutionary was their democratic accessibility. Here was high art applied to mass transit, beauty offered freely to every Parisian who needed to travel across the city. The movement carried within itself this democratic impulse, this belief that beauty should permeate all aspects of life, rather than being reserved for palaces and museums. An Art Nouveau designer might lavish the same attention on a door handle or a wallpaper pattern as Renaissance masters had devoted to their altarpieces, because the quotidian deserved beauty too. The Belgian innovations, Horta and Van der Velde. Belgium, and specifically Brussels, became one of Art Nouveau's most important centres, producing innovations that would influence the movement's development across Europe. The social and political context of Belgium in the 1890s created particularly fertile ground for artistic experimentation. This was a prosperous, industrialised nation, with a newly wealthy bourgeoisie eager to embrace cultural modernity and distinguished themselves from both the old aristocracy and the working classes below them. They wanted homes that reflected their progressive values and sophisticated tastes, and they found the perfect interpreter of these desires in Victor Horta. Horta's breakthrough came with the Hotel Tassel, a private residence he designed in Brussels between 1892 and 1893. Walking into this building even today feels like entering a completely realized aesthetic universe where every element speaks the same visual language. The famous staircase forms the heart of the design, its iron railings branching into delicate tendrils that seem to grow organically from the structural supports. The floor tiles feature flowing, biomorphic patterns that echo the curves of the metalwork. The walls curve instead of meeting at right angles, creating a sense of fluid space that feels almost musical in its harmonies. Light plays a crucial role in Horta's interiors. He understood that natural light could be channeled and shaped to create specific atmospheric effects, that coloured glass could transform ordinary daylight into something magical, that the interplay of light and shadow could emphasise the three-dimensional qualities of his organic forms. The Hotel Tassel uses a skylight to flood the stairwell, with illumination that filters down through the building, creating a kind of interior garden bathed in ever-changing natural light. What Horta achieved in the Hotel Tassel was what would later be called a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art where architecture, interior design, furniture, fixtures and decorative details all harmonise into a coherent whole. He created everything, down to the door handles and the fireplace surrounds, ensuring that each element contributed to the overall aesthetic effect. This holistic approach became one of Art Nouveau's defining characteristics. The other great Belgian theorist and practitioner of Art Nouveau was Henry van der Velde, who brought to the movement a more intellectual, philosophical dimension. Van der Velde started his career as a painter, but became convinced that the applied arts and design offered more potential for social transformation than easel painting. He argued that beauty in everyday objects could elevate the lives of ordinary people, that good design represented a kind of moral imperative in industrial society. Van der Velde's approach to design emphasized what he called the dynamographic quality of line, the idea that curves and flowing forms possessed an inherent dynamism and energy that straight lines and rigid geometry lacked. When you look at a Van der Velde chair or candlestick or poster, you see this philosophy in action. The forms seem to pulse with internal movement, with forces held in dynamic equilibrium. A Van der Velde chair does not sit there passively. Its curves and countercurves create a sense of potential motion, of energy about to be released. The Parisian scene, Guimard, Gallet and the Nancy School. Paris, the undisputed artistic capital of the late 19th century, naturally became a major centre for Art Nouveau, though the movement developed there along somewhat different lines than in Belgium. French Art Nouveau tended toward greater decorative richness and a more explicit embrace of luxury materials and techniques. This reflected both the strength of French craft traditions, particularly in areas like glassmaking and furniture, and the demands of the Parisian market, which wanted objects that proclaimed their expense and refinement. We've already mentioned Hector Guimard's metro entrances, but his work extended far beyond those iconic structures. Guimard designed complete buildings that embodied Art Nouveau principles from foundation to roofline. The Castel Béranger, an apartment building he completed in 1898, features an asymmetrical facade where each window seems individually designed, where iron balconies curl and twist like vines, where the entrance gate creates an explosion of organic metalwork that seems almost aggressively anti-classical in its refusal of symmetry and its embrace of the irregular. Guimard, like many Art Nouveau architects, believed that buildings should express their internal organisation externally, that facades should reflect what was happening inside rather than applying a uniform, symmetrical mask regardless of the interior arrangement. This led to designs that modern eyes might find chaotic or undisciplined, but which the practitioners understood as truthful and organic. A building, after all, houses different functions in different parts: larger public rooms, smaller private chambers, staircases and service areas. So why should its exterior pretend to a uniformity that didn't exist within? Then we have Gal. Gallet approached glass as a painter approaches canvas, as a medium capable of expressing complex emotions and ideas. His vases and vessels featured layered coloured glass that he would carve and acid etch to create images of extraordinary delicacy and depth. A typical Gallet piece might show a landscape of flowering trees emerging from mist, dragonflies hovering over water, autumn leaves drifting down through twilight air. The images seem to exist within the glass itself, suspended in its translucent depths, like specimens preserved in amber. The technique Gallet perfected involved building up multiple layers of different coloured glass while the piece was still hot, then working the cooled vessel with wheels and acid to selectively remove portions of the outer layers, revealing the colours beneath and creating effects of remarkable complexity. A single Gallet vase might contain 5 or 6 different colours of glass, each carefully chosen and layered to produce the desired final effect. The process required tremendous skill and experience, an understanding of how different glasses would interact, how acids would bite into various formulations, how light would move through the finished piece. But Gallet brought more to his work than technical mastery. He was a serious botanist who studied plants systematically, understanding their structures and growth patterns with scientific precision before translating them into glass. He was also deeply literary, often inscribing his vessels with lines of poetry by symbolist writers like Mallarmé and Baudelaire. His work embodied Art Nouveau's synthesis of different domains: science, art, literature, craft, into objects that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Around Gallet gathered a community of designers and craftspeople known as the École de Nancy, or Nancy School. This included furniture makers like Louis Majorelle, who created pieces where structural elements like table legs or chair backs curved and branched like tree limbs, where marquetry inlays depicted water lilies and orchids, and other Art Nouveau botanical favourites. Majorelle's furniture combined exotic woods like mahogany and amaranth with gilded bronze fittings shaped like plants, creating pieces that functioned as sculpture as much as utilitarian objects. Alphonse Mucha and the art of the poster. Art Nouveau found one of its most accessible and influential expressions in the art of the poster, and the master of this medium was Alphonse Mucha, a Czech artist working in Paris who almost single-handedly defined what we now think of as the Art Nouveau graphic style. Mucha's breakthrough came in 1894, when he was asked to create a poster for a play starring Sarah Bernhardt, the greatest actress of the age. The resulting image of Bernhardt in Byzantine robes, surrounded by a mosaic-like halo and framed by flowing organic forms, caused a sensation. Suddenly, everyone in Paris wanted a Mucha poster. He designed advertisements for everything from theatrical productions to cigarette papers, from champagne to bicycles, and each design bore his unmistakable stamp. Mucha's women, and they were almost always women, inhabited a world somewhere between the earthly and the divine. They gazed out at the viewer with expressions both inviting and remote, their abundant hair flowing around them like living decoration, often studded with flowers or stars or abstract ornamental elements. They wore robes that suggested various historical periods: Byzantine, medieval, Renaissance, but transformed them into something outside of historical time, into a kind of eternal feminine. The decorative elements in Mucha's posters operated according to a carefully controlled visual logic. He would typically place his central figure within a framework of geometric shapes, circles, rectangles, arches, then fill the remaining space with organic decoration that seemed to grow from the figure herself. Flowers and vines intertwined with abstract patterns, creating a horror vacui that somehow never felt cluttered because of Mucha's masterful control of colour and composition. Colour in Mucha's work deserves special attention. He favoured a palette of muted, sophisticated tones, dusty pinks and soft golds, sage greens and warm browns, colours that seem to have been aged slightly, given a patina of elegance. These colours appeared in flat areas punctuated by fine line work, creating images that could be reproduced through the lithographic printing process while maintaining their visual impact. This was crucial because these were, after all, commercial posters meant to be printed in large quantities and pasted on walls throughout the city. Mucha understood something profound about the relationship between art and commerce, between high culture and popular culture. His posters elevated advertising to the level of fine art, while making art accessible to ordinary people who might never set foot in a gallery, but who encountered his work on their daily walks through Paris. People began collecting his posters, removing them from walls and framing them, treating commercial advertisements as artworks worthy of preservation and display. The influence of Mucha's graphic style spread worldwide through the very commercial success that made his posters ubiquitous. Artists across Europe and America absorbed his visual vocabulary, the flowing hair, the flattened space, the integration of figure and ornament, the sophisticated color harmonies, and adapted it to their own purposes. Art Nouveau graphics became almost synonymous with the Mucha style, even though he represented only one variant of a much more diverse movement. Typography formed an essential component of Mucha's designs, integrated into the overall composition rather than being awkwardly appended. He often designed custom lettering for each poster, creating alphabets that flowed and curved in harmony with the organic elements of the design. The text became part of the decorative scheme, with letters that might sprout tendrils or incorporate floral motifs, making the very act of reading a visual pleasure. Gaudí and the Spanish variation. While Art Nouveau flowered across Europe, nowhere did it produce more extraordinary architectural achievements than in Barcelona, where Antoni Gaudí spent his entire career creating buildings that seemed to belong to some alternative reality, where the normal rules of architecture simply don't apply. Gaudí's work represents Art Nouveau pushed to its most extreme, most visionary conclusions. Architecture that doesn't just incorporate organic forms, but seems itself to be a living organism. Gaudí came from a family of coppersmiths, and this early exposure to metalworking gave him an intuitive understanding of how materials could be shaped and formed. He studied architecture in Barcelona, but chafed against the academic teaching, finding the classical rules and regulations stifling. He looked instead to nature for his lessons, studying the structural logic of trees and shells and bones, understanding that nature had spent millions of years solving engineering problems, and that these solutions possessed both structural efficiency and inherent beauty. His early commissions included conventional buildings with Art Nouveau decoration applied. But Gaudí quickly moved beyond surface ornament towards something more fundamental. He began to reconceive architecture from its structural foundations upward, developing innovative techniques that allowed him to create forms that seemed to defy gravity and logic. His famous use of catenary arches, the natural curve that a hanging chain assumes, created spaces of extraordinary grace and structural efficiency. Where traditional architecture fought against gravity through massive walls and buttresses, Gaudí worked with gravitational forces, channeling them through curved forms that turned structural necessity into visual poetry. The Casa Batlló, which Gaudí renovated between 1904 and 1906, shows his mature style in full flower. The building's facade undulates like the surface of a wind-touched lake, its balconies shaped like masks or skulls depending on how you read them, its roof covered with scales of ceramic tile that shimmer with iridescent colour. The building has been interpreted as representing St. George and the dragon, with the roof suggesting the dragon's scaly back. But Gaudí himself remained ambiguous about such readings, preferring to let the building speak its own visual language. Inside the Casa Batlló, curves dominate everything. There are almost no right angles, no flat surfaces. Walls curve and flow, ceilings undulate overhead, doorways and windows assume organic shapes. The central light well is tiled in gradations of blue, darker at the top where more light enters, lighter at the bottom, creating an effect like looking up through water toward the surface. Gaudí designed furniture specifically for the building, chairs and benches that curve to fit the human body, that seem grown rather than constructed. The Casa Mila, known as La Pedrera or the Quarry for its rough stone facade, pushed even further into the realm of organic architecture. The building presents a completely irregular facade to the street, its stone surface carved into wave-like forms that suggest wind-eroded cliffs or ocean breakers frozen in stone. The roof, a masterpiece of sculptural imagination, features chimneys and ventilation towers shaped like mysterious hooded figures, like surreal warriors standing guard over the city. Gaudí transformed the utilitarian elements of the building, chimneys, air vents, water towers, into sculpture, demonstrating his conviction that every part of a building deserved aesthetic consideration. But Gaudí's most ambitious and ultimately incomplete project remains the Sagrada Familia, the great basilica he began in 1883 and worked on until his death in 1926. The building represents Gaudí's attempt to create a kind of ultimate synthesis of architecture, sculpture, and spiritual meaning. A building that would function as a sermon in stone. The facade depicts the Nativity in extraordinary detail, with hundreds of carved figures and natural forms, flowers, birds, trees, all integrated into the architectural framework. The structural innovations Gaudí developed for the Sagrada Familia revolutionized church architecture. He designed tree-like columns that branch as they rise, supporting the roof through a geometric system derived from natural forms. The interior of the church, as it has been completed following Gaudí's plans, feels like being inside a stone forest, with light filtering down through coloured glass like sunlight through leaves. He spent years creating models using weighted strings and bags of shot to calculate the exact forms his catenary arches should take, inverting the models to turn hanging chains into standing arches, turning gravity from enemy into ally. Gaudí's Catholicism became increasingly intense as he aged, and he saw his architectural work as a form of prayer, a way of glorifying God through the creation of beauty. The Sagrada Familia represents the fullest expression of this spiritual dimension of his work, though all his buildings carry within them a sense of the sacred, a conviction that the act of shaping space and light and material could touch something transcendent. The Viennese Secession, Klimt and the Gesamtkunstwerk. Vienna at the turn of the 20th century stood at the crossroads between tradition and modernity, between the fading glories of the Habsburg Empire and the psychological and cultural upheavals that would define the new century. This was the Vienna of Freud and Mahler, of the waltz and the coffee house, of spectacular imperial architecture housing a society increasingly aware of its own decay and decadence. Into this complex cultural milieu came the Vienna Secession, a group of artists who broke away from the Conservative Academy in 1897 to forge their own path. Gustav Klimt emerged as the Secession's most famous artist, creating paintings that synthesized Art Nouveau's decorative richness with psychological and erotic intensity. Klimt's work operates in a realm where symbolism and decoration become inseparable, where the flatness of the picture plane gets broken by passages of almost hallucinatory ornamental detail. His famous painting, The Kiss, shows two lovers embracing, their bodies almost entirely covered by robes decorated with geometric and organic patterns, gold leaf creating passages of shimmering splendor. The painting exists somewhere between representation and pure decoration, the lovers merging with the patterns that cover them until it becomes unclear where flesh ends and ornamentation begins. This use of gold leaf connected Klimt's work to Byzantine mosaics and medieval illuminated manuscripts, but he deployed these historical techniques in service of thoroughly modern content. His portraits of Viennese society women showed them surrounded by fields of abstract pattern and colour, their faces emerging from seas of decoration like islands from churning water. These paintings operated as both realistic portraits and decorative objects, simultaneously documenting their subjects and transforming them into elements of a purely aesthetic realm. The Secession Building, designed by Joseph Maria Olbrich and completed in 1898, provided an architectural manifesto for the movement. The building's most striking feature is its dome of gilded laurel leaves, a great golden sphere that sits atop an otherwise relatively austere white structure. Above the entrance, the building's motto appears, Der Zeit ihre Kunst, der Kunst ihre Freiheit. To every age its art, to art its freedom. This declaration captured the movement's essential position. Its insistence that contemporary art should speak in the language of its own time rather than endlessly recycling historical forms. Inside the Secession building, temporary exhibitions showcase the work of both Viennese artists and international figures, introducing the Viennese public to developments in art and design from across Europe. The building itself functioned as a kind of temple to contemporary art, a space dedicated to the proposition that art represented one of life's highest values, that aesthetic experience could provide meaning and transcendence in an increasingly materialistic, rationalized world. The architect Otto Wagner brought Art Nouveau principles to a range of building types, from apartment buildings to churches to railway stations. His buildings typically featured exposed structural frameworks filled with decorative elements, a kind of honesty about construction combined with rich surface treatment. His Majolica House apartment building features a facade completely covered with floral patterned ceramic tiles, turning the entire building surface into a kind of three-dimensional artwork. As the building rises, the pattern gradually fades, creating a subtle gradient effect that gives the structure a sense of lightness and dematerialization. Wagner also designed numerous stations for Vienna's Stadtbahn urban railway system, applying Art Nouveau decoration to utilitarian transportation infrastructure. These stations feature iron and glass construction with elegant curved forms and ornamental details, demonstrating that even the most functional buildings could embody beauty and craftsmanship. Wagner believed that modern life required modern architectural forms, but that these forms should be enhanced through appropriate decoration rather than left bare and purely functional. The Viennese version of Art Nouveau carried within itself a particular psychological intensity, a fascination with desire and death, with the erotic and the morbid, that reflected the broader currents of Viennese culture at the time. Where French Art Nouveau might present a woman surrounded by flowers as simple decorative beauty, Klimt's women gaze out with disturbing intensity, their sexuality both celebrated and somehow threatening, their bodies disappearing into decorative patterns that suggest both luxury and entrapment. The Glasgow Four and the British development. While Art Nouveau never achieved the same dominance in Britain that it enjoyed on the continent, the movement produced distinctive variants that influenced international developments. The Glasgow Four, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Margaret MacDonald, Francis MacDonald, and Herbert McNair, created a particularly refined, austere version of the Art Nouveau aesthetic that emphasized vertical lines, geometric forms, and a restricted color palette, usually based around white, silver, pink, and green. Mackintosh, the most famous of the group, designed buildings, interiors, and furniture that combined Art Nouveau's organic forms with a geometric rigor that anticipated modernist aesthetics. His masterwork, the Glasgow School of Art, shows this synthesis beautifully. The building's exterior is largely austere and functional, its windows arranged to maximize northern light for the studios within. But specific elements, the entrance, the ironwork, certain decorative details, bloom with Art Nouveau curves and botanical forms. Inside the School of Art, Mackintosh created spaces of extraordinary atmosphere. The library, with its dark wood columns and hanging light fixtures, feels almost Japanese in its restraint and careful composition, each element precisely placed to create specific visual and spatial effects. The furniture Mackintosh designed for the building features his characteristic tall, thin proportions, chairs with backs that stretch impossibly upward, tables and desks that emphasize vertical lines while incorporating subtle curves and organic details. Mackintosh's collaboration with his wife Margaret MacDonald produced some of the movement's most hauntingly beautiful decorative panels. These featured elongated female figures surrounded by roses and other flowers, rendered in a highly stylized manner that emphasized two-dimensional pattern over naturalistic representation. The figures seem to float in undefined space, their gestures mysterious and symbolic, their eyes often closed or gazing inward, suggesting an interior psychological realm. rather than engagement with the external world. The tea rooms that Mackintosh designed for Kate Cranston in Glasgow represent Art Nouveau's application to commercial interiors, creating complete aesthetic environments for public use. The Willow tea rooms feature furniture, light fixtures, wall decorations, and architectural details all designed by Mackintosh and MacDonald, creating spaces that functioned as both commercial establishments and artistic statements. Visitors came for the tea but stayed for the aesthetic experience, for the chance to inhabit a completely realised artistic vision. The British arts and crafts movement, led by figures like William Morris, shared Art Nouveau's rejection of Victorian historicism and its commitment to craft and quality, but maintained a more medievalist, less organic aesthetic. Morris's patterns featured flowers and birds, rendered in a flat, stylised manner, quite different from Art Nouveau's flowing curves. And his political convictions led him to reject the luxury materials and techniques that many Art Nouveau designers embraced. However, the movements shared enough common ground that they influenced each other, particularly in the realm of decorative arts and book design. Arthur Liberty's London department store became such an important purveyor of Art Nouveau objects and textiles that in Italy, the movement became known as Stile Liberty. Liberty's sold objects from across Europe, Tiffany glass from America, furniture from France and Austria, textiles with flowing organic patterns, making Art Nouveau accessible to British consumers while also disseminating British design internationally. The Liberty style emphasised rich materials, particularly silk fabrics printed with organic patterns in sophisticated colour combinations, objects that brought Art Nouveau's aesthetic into relatively affluent British homes. The American expression, Tiffany and Sullivan. Art Nouveau crossed the Atlantic and found fertile ground in America, though it developed there according to the specific conditions and traditions of American culture. Louis Comfort Tiffany, son of the famous jeweller Charles Louis Tiffany, became the movement's most important American practitioner, creating glass objects and windows of extraordinary beauty and technical innovation. Tiffany's great breakthrough came with his development of what he called favrial glass, an iridescent glass that shimmered with colour, capturing and refracting light in ways that ordinary glass could not. He achieved this effect through a combination of chemical treatments and innovative manufacturing techniques, creating glass that seemed almost alive, that changed appearance depending on the angle and quality of light falling upon it. A Tiffany vase might glow with peacock colours, shifting from deep blue to green to purple as you moved around it, the surface seeming to contain trapped light. But Tiffany is probably most famous for his lamps. Those extraordinary creations where hundreds or sometimes thousands of pieces of hand-cut coloured glass are assembled into shades shaped like wisteria blossoms, or dragonflies, or grape clusters, or peacock feathers. These lamps functioned as both light sources and sculpture, objects that were beautiful when unlit, but became transcendent when illuminated from within, the light transforming the coloured glass into something magical, like captured sunset or autumn forest. The technical challenges involved in creating a Tiffany lamp were immense. Each piece of glass had to be individually cut to fit the design, wrapped in copper foil, then soldered together to create the shade. The selection of glass required extraordinary skill and artistic judgment, choosing pieces that would interact in interesting ways, that would create the right balance of colours and textures when lit. A single lampshade might contain a dozen different types of glass, some transparent, some translucent, some opaque, some smooth, some textured, some plain, some iridescent, all carefully orchestrated to produce the desired final effect. Tiffany also created spectacular stained glass windows for churches and wealthy homes, often featuring elaborate landscapes or floral compositions. Unlike traditional stained glass, which relied primarily on painted details on relatively plain glass, Tiffany windows used the inherent qualities of the glass itself, its colour, texture, opacity, to create their effects. He would select individual pieces of glass for their particular visual properties, sometimes using fractures or irregularities in the glass as positive features rather than defects, understanding that these imperfections could contribute to the overall aesthetic impact.
The commercial structure Tiffany established to produce and market his work represents an interesting hybrid of artisanal craft and industrial production. His studios employed hundreds of workers, glassblowers, cutters, assemblers, designers, organized in a kind of workshop system that allowed for relatively large-scale production while maintaining high standards of quality and craftsmanship. This model allowed Art Nouveau objects to reach a much broader market than purely handcrafted production could have served, though the most elaborate pieces remained extraordinarily expensive. In architecture, Louis Sullivan brought Art Nouveau principles to the development of the skyscraper, that quintessentially American building type. Sullivan believed that tall buildings should express their vertical nature, that their facades should emphasize height rather than fighting against it through horizontal divisions and classical elements. His buildings feature relatively plain wall surfaces, punctuated by elaborate Art Nouveau ornament, concentrated at entrances, around windows, and at the cornice line. Sullivan's ornament, which he called efflorescence, featured organic forms abstracted and geometricized, botanical elements transformed into something between representation and pure decoration. The Carson, Peary, Scott and Company building in Chicago shows this approach beautifully. The main facade is relatively austere, its windows arranged in a straightforward grid that expresses the building's steel frame structure. But the ground floor and entrance are covered with elaborate cast iron ornament featuring flowing, organic forms that seem to grow across the surface. Sullivan articulated the famous principle, form follows function, though he understood this in a broader sense than later modernists would. For Sullivan, function included not just practical utility, but also the building's purpose and meaning, its role in the urban landscape, the experience it created for people who used it. Ornament served a function too, in his view, providing visual interest and beauty, making the building a positive contribution to the city, rather than just a container for commercial activities. Frank Lloyd Wright, Sullivan's protégé, absorbed Art Nouveau influences but transformed them into something distinctly his own, what he called organic architecture. Wright's prairie houses feature flowing horizontal lines, interlocking spaces, and integration with the landscape that reflect Art Nouveau principles. But his aesthetic vocabulary drew more from geometry and abstraction than from botanical forms. His furniture and light fixtures and decorative glass windows show Art Nouveau influence transformed through his personal vision. Organic forms rationalized into geometric patterns, materials techniques and the luxury trade. Art Nouveau elevated certain materials and techniques to particular prominence, creating a hierarchy of aesthetic value that reflected both technical difficulty and visual effect. Glass, as we've seen, became almost synonymous with the movement, exploited for its unique properties of transparency, color, and light transmission. But beyond glass, Art Nouveau designers worked in an enormous range of materials, often combining them in innovative ways. Jewellery design underwent a complete revolution during the Art Nouveau period, largely through the work of designers like René Lalique in France, where 19th century jewellery had emphasised the value of materials, diamonds, gold, precious gems. Art Nouveau jewellery prized aesthetic effect over monetary worth. Lalique created pieces featuring semi-precious stones, enamel, horn and other materials chosen for their visual properties rather than their market value. A typical Lalique brooch might feature a dragonfly with translucent plique-à-jour enamel wings that glowed with colour when light passed through them, its body formed from baroque pearls or carved horn, the whole piece more valuable as art than as a collection of materials. This represented a radical shift in how luxury was conceived, from material wealth to artistic achievement, from ostentation to sophistication. The technique of plique-à-jour enamelling deserves special mention, as it became particularly associated with Art Nouveau jewellery. This technique involves creating enamel that has no backing, held only by thin metal framework, so that light can pass through it like stained glass. The effect is extraordinarily delicate and beautiful, but the technique is extremely difficult, requiring great skill and patience. Many pieces fail during firing, making successful plique-à-jour jewellery rare and precious. Furniture makers explored the expressive possibilities of wood, often using exotic species like mahogany, rosewood, or ebony for their rich colours and grain patterns.
They incorporated marquetry, the art of creating pictures from thin veneers of different coloured woods, to add botanical or abstract decoration to surfaces. Louis Majorel's furniture often featured marquetry, depicting water lilies or orchids or abstract organic forms, the different woods carefully chosen and arranged to create subtle gradations of colour and tone. The technique of bent wood, pioneered by manufacturers like Thone, allowed furniture makers to create flowing curves without the need for complex joinery. A bent wood chair could be made from continuous curves of steamed and bent beech, creating forms of great elegance and structural efficiency. While bentwood furniture predated Art Nouveau, the technique aligned perfectly with the movement's emphasis on flowing lines, and many designers incorporated bent elements into their work. Metalwork, particularly in iron and bronze, became one of Art Nouveau's signature media. The malleability of iron when heated allowed craftspeople to create extraordinarily complex, organic forms, while bronze could be cast to capture every detail of an original sculpture or model. Art Nouveau designers created railings, gates, light fixtures, door handles, and countless other metal objects that transformed utilitarian items into works of art. The lost wax casting technique allowed for particularly fine detail in bronze work. This ancient technique involves creating a model in wax, encasing it in plaster or clay, then heating the whole assembly so the wax melts and runs out, leaving a cavity that can be filled with molten bronze. When the metal cools and the mould is broken away, the result is a bronze object that captures every detail of the original wax model. Art Nouveau designers used this technique to create everything from small decorative objects to large architectural elements. Textiles and wallpapers provided another crucial medium for disseminating Art Nouveau design. Unlike unique objects like furniture or glass vessels, textiles and papers could be produced in relatively large quantities, bringing the movement's aesthetic into middle-class homes. Designers created patterns featuring flowing organic forms, often based on botanical subjects rendered in stylized, flattened forms suitable for repetitive patterning. The technical challenges of textile design deserve recognition. Creating a pattern that reads well when repeated across a large surface, that doesn't create awkward visual breaks at the joins, that works in the intended colours and at the intended scale, requires both artistic sensibility and technical understanding. Art Nouveau textile designers mastered these challenges, creating patterns that could be infinitely repeated while maintaining visual interest and coherence. The symbolic and literary dimensions. Art Nouveau cannot be fully understood without considering its relationship to symbolist literature and poetry, to the broader currents of fin de siècle culture that emphasize mystery, suggestion, and the evocation of mood over direct representation or narrative. The movement shared symbolism's conviction that art should hint at deeper truths rather than depicting surface reality, that beauty carried within itself a kind of spiritual or philosophical meaning that transcended mere decoration. The frequent appearance of certain motifs in Art Nouveau work carries symbolic weight beyond their decorative function. The peacock, with its iridescent plumage, an association with vanity and beauty, appears constantly in Art Nouveau decoration. The lily, with its connotations of purity, death and transformation, adorns everything from jewellery to architectural details. The dragonfly, that creature of air and water, of metamorphosis and evanescence, becomes almost an emblem of the movement itself. Female figures in Art Nouveau work often function as symbolic embodiments of natural forces, of the seasons, of abstract qualities like music or poetry or dream. These women exist in a realm outside normal social reality, their abundant hair merging with botanical elements, their poses suggesting ritual or dance or meditation rather than quotidian activity. They embody what might be called an aestheticized femininity, womanhood transformed into a primarily visual and symbolic category, rather than a social or political one. This treatment of the feminine raises complex questions that continue to generate scholarly debate. On one hand, Art Nouveau's obsessive representation of beautiful women in decorative contexts can be read as reducing women to ornamental objects, as reinforcing traditional associations between femininity and passivity, beauty and nature. The movement's ideal woman rarely appears engaged in meaningful activity. She exists to be looked at, to embody beauty and grace, to serve as a vehicle for decorative elaboration. On the other hand, These figures sometimes carry a sense of power and mystery that complicates simple readings of them as passive objects. Klimt's women gaze out with knowing, almost challenging expressions. Mucha's figures sometimes embody specific contemporary women, actresses like Sarah Bernhardt, who are anything but passive. The femme fatale, that symbolist archetype of dangerous feminine sexuality, appears throughout Art Nouveau work, suggesting an anxiety about female power, even as it objectifies women. The movement's relationship to eroticism deserves attention as well. Art Nouveau emerged during a period of intense debate about sexuality, gender roles, and the nature of desire. The work of Freud and other sexologists was beginning to map the unconscious and theorize sexuality in new ways. Art Nouveau participated in this broader cultural conversation, creating images that acknowledged erotic desire while displacing it into the realm of aesthetics and decoration. The sinuous lines and organic forms that characterize Art Nouveau carry their own erotic charge, suggesting bodily curves and natural fecundity, growth and flowering. The integration of figure and ornament, the way women's hair flows into decorative tendrils, or their robes merge with background patterns, creates a kind of visual equivalence between the female body and natural forms, between human sexuality and organic growth and reproduction. The idea of synesthesia, the blurring of boundaries between different sensory experiences, fascinated both symbolist writers and Art Nouveau artists. They sought to create works that would evoke multiple senses simultaneously, that would suggest music through visual forms or create visual equivalents of poetic effects. Whistler's paintings with musical titles like Nocturne or Symphony pointed toward this synthesis, as did Wagner's concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which influenced Art Nouveau's own holistic approach to design. The secret Art Nouveau understood is that organic forms work as technology for altering consciousness. Those curves and flowing lines create specific effects on the nervous system. When you enter a space where everything moves in wave-like rhythms, where one curve leads inevitably to another, your breathing changes. Your eye movement changes. The quality of your attention shifts from sharp, categorical thinking into something more fluid, associative, dreamlike. Art Nouveau designers grasped something about resonance between external form and internal state. The sinuous lines mirror how attention itself moves when free, flowing, spiraling, returning to themes with variation. Living inside these environments for extended periods reshapes how your consciousness operates. You begin thinking in curves, in metamorphoses, in organic emergence. There's also a deeper layer about liminality. Art Nouveau loved threshold states, dawn, dusk, the moment between waking and sleep. The style captures this quality of in-betweenness, where forms seem caught mid-transformation, where a woman's hair becomes water, becomes flame. This teaches consciousness to rest in transition, rather than grasping for fixed states. The designs invite you into a perpetual becoming. The movement also understood something about enchantment as a psychological technology. When every object in your environment carries elaborate attention, when someone has clearly spent hours carving a door handle into a flowering branch, this affects you. You start treating your surroundings as alive, as deserving of notice and care. The environment becomes animate, responsive, full of presence. This is exactly what traditional societies achieved through ritual and ornament. They kept the world feeling participatory, rather than dead matter to be used. Art Nouveau also worked with synesthesia deliberately. The forms suggest music, the colours evoke sense, everything bleeds across sensory boundaries. A lamp becomes a flower, becomes light itself. This cross-modal resonance creates a particular richness of experience, where perception stays alive and multi-dimensional, rather than flattening into utilitarian recognition. Learning Art Nouveau begins with training your perception to see the intelligence in growing things. You spend hours watching how a vine spirals up a trellis, how petals arrange themselves around a centre, how water flows over stone and creates those inevitable curves. This observation goes deeper than sketching. You're absorbing the underlying logic of organic form, the principles that generate those shapes, and after enough time your eye begins recognising these patterns everywhere, seeing the same spiral in a fern frond and a snail shell, and a breaking wave. Your hand needs to learn the whiplash curve as a physical gesture, a movement that flows through your whole arm. You fill pages with this S-shaped line that thickens and thins, practicing until it emerges as naturally as your handwriting, until you can make it fast or slow, tight or loose, each variation feeling alive. The line should feel like it's pulling itself from your pencil, growing the way plants grow, and this only happens through repetition. Hundreds, thousands of these curves until your muscles hold the pattern at an unconscious level. Then you bring your hands to actual materials and let each one teach you its language. Copper wire shows you how much pressure creates a gentle curve, where it wants to move, how it holds tension, and you bend it repeatedly, feeling its character, learning to work with its preferences. Wood teaches you about grain and direction, showing you where it welcomes carving and how it responds to your tools. Glass, when heated, moves like liquid, but freezes whatever gesture you make into permanent form, which demands confidence and clarity. Each material becomes a teacher, revealing its own possibilities through direct handling. Integration thinking develops as you start seeing every element as part of a larger conversation. When you design a door handle, you imagine how its curve might echo in the door frame, how that pattern could flow into the wall molding, how the whole room could speak the same visual language. And you learn to think in systems where each piece responds to and amplifies every other piece, creating rhythmic patterns that move through space the way musical phrases move through time. Asymmetric balance becomes something you feel in your body. You develop a sense for when a composition needs weight elsewhere, when one side can be dense with detail while the other stays open, finding that precise moment where tension and resolution meet. And this lives in your gut. You know when you found it, the same way you know when you're standing balanced. Your eye trains itself to work at human scale, creating details that reward close attention. And you learn to layer depth, so there's always something more to discover. Foreground patterns that reveal middle ground complexity that opens into background subtlety. This gives perception somewhere to go, keeps attention engaged and moving through the work. Materials start revealing their qualities the more you work with them. Iron shows you its strength while demonstrating how far it can bend. Glass teaches you about light transformation and colour. Wood carries memory of seasons and growth, and you learn to let each substance express what it naturally offers, working with its inherent properties. And as you do this, the materials bring their qualities into whatever you create. Your practice deepens through direct copying of masterworks, tracing Mucha's posters, or Horta's architectural drawings, feeling through your hand how they solve specific problems of composition and flow. This feels like apprenticeship across time, learning directly from those who have already walked this path, and eventually, their solutions become springboards for your own work. You find yourself able to look at a blank space and see the organic forms that want to grow there, the way an experienced gardener sees the mature garden in an empty plot of soil. And this vision comes from having trained your perception so thoroughly that the principles live inside you, ready to express themselves through whatever materials you touch.